presentation to Captain James Hook. Because of all of the supervillains, Galactus, Lex Luthor, Jafar, Scar, Cruella de Vil, the one that I like the most is Captain James Hook. And it's not unrelated to the subject here. I don't mean that I like him the most and that I think he's the greatest of supervillains. I don't think he'd stand a chance against Alien or Predator. But I mean, I really like him. There's certainly things you could scold him about, like trying to tie Princess Tiger Lily to an anchor was not really great form, and thankfully she was rescued. But in general, I can say that Captain Hook never had any intention to rule the world, to obliterate the race of men. He was a tyrannical captain to his crew, you might say, and this is what I would argue, because Peter Pan made him crazy. Peter Pan made this guy absolutely insane. Peter Pan is quite often an impudent imp. He's arrogant, he's a tease, leading on poor Tinkerbell her whole fairy life. He's ungrateful. When Wendy reattached his shadow, Peter Pan congratulated himself instead of her. He flies about taunting his youth, never growing up. Look at me, I've got this band of lost boys. He's a deranged cult leader, encouraging them to think that growing up is wicked. He even calls them blockheads. He refuses to grow up, and we all know people like him, and they annoy us. And Peter Pan annoys Captain Hook, and who wouldn't be annoyed? Captain Hook is always elegantly dressed, and according to the author of Peter Pan, James Barrie, who must have liked Hook because he has the same first name, Barrie said that Hook was a wonderful storyteller, loved flowers, sweet music, was a talented musician. In fact, he played the flute in the stage play and the harpsichord in the Disney film. He's often melancholy over the fact that children don't like him. He named his ship the Jolly Roger Galleon, which means that he probably at some point was a pretty happy guy until Peter came along. He tries to get Peter Pan to walk the plank. He's never been successful. He's always been outwitted. Peter flitting around in his green loincloth, whereas poor Hook in a duel, Peter Pan lops off one of his hands, which you would probably want to get revenge over also. And here's the interesting thing, that hand, which is eaten by that crocodile, is so delicious that the crocodile wants more. Captain Hook is a delicious villain. He's gentlemanly towards Wendy. No one seems to remember that it was Peter Pan who lured her and her brothers from their flat in Kensington Gardens in the first place, and then made the poor girl his surrogate mother. That the crocodile who ate Hook's hand also swallowed a clock which ticked, so that whenever it was near, Hook knew because of the tick, 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 that his days were numbered, that he was getting older, that he was no longer young like Peter Pan, and that while he flew around, boasting and careless, quick to point out how great he is, look at me, forever young, that devouring clock circles the captain and the rest of us and makes us crazy. So, back to the subject.
Is that the sermon?
That was the sermon. But back to the subject. We are taught to love our God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our might, and to teach these words to our children. The French historian Philip Aries argued that childhood is a modern invention, that in medieval times there was no such thing as childhood as we know it today. He says that it's a relatively new concept, that it emerged around the 17th century, probably in relationship to a decline in infant mortality, among other things. So when infant mortality was very high, parents steeled themselves against having any kind of real emotional attachment to their children, and against seeing their children as unique, precious individuals. So I experienced that a little bit when I was in the developing world in Swaziland, when I was doing research for a novel, and I was meeting with families whose daughters who had albinism were slaughtered, beheaded, mutilated. And I had expected to walk into these homes and experience a kind of grief that I was familiar with, what grief looks like when you lose a child. And instead, the kind of grief that I experienced when I walked in these homes was one of utilitarianism, was now we don't have somebody to collect the water from the river, now we don't have somebody to cook the food. And that the family was really in trouble because of this that they were now missing this person, and there wasn't really room in that space to also mourn this person's potential. That the job of a child wasn't really to thrive, Whereas for our children, their only job really is to thrive up until a certain point. Aries wrote that it used to be that most people before the 18th century didn't even know their birthday and couldn't tell you how old they were. Now, it's one of the first things you ask a kid. How old are you? I'm 4. So we're very conscious of people's ages. Pre-18th century, an individual was deemed an infant, a youth, or an old person, not based on their chronology, but based on their behavior. So a toddler could be considered an infant, a 50-year-old man could be considered an infant, and we know some of those as well. Children throughout the Middle Ages were seen as miniature adults, and you can see that in paintings, of course, reflected in the artwork. But as children began to survive childhood, Aries and parents started to take more interest in them, and then a culture of childhood was born. And what's interesting is a lot of the stories, like fairy tales, were adult stories. And as we started to create this culture of childhood, where families became more child-centric, those stories transferred from adults to children. Snowball fights used to be things that whole villages participated in, adults and children, multi-generational. But all of these things became kind of hand-me-downs. Even clothing, like ribbons, were hand-me-down clothing from adults to children that were kind of tattered, and then eventually became a style that people would dress children in. It's not tatters, but these ribbons. And what's interesting is that the more their families started to pay attention to their children, by the 19th century, you have artwork where children are really center in the family portrait, and you even have portraits of dead children, which shows that they were worthy of being mourned. You didn't have people painting portraits and memorializing their children in that way. And as families became more focused on their children, families became more insular. And it affects all of society because the whole family kind of aligns itself around their child, and to the point where the child actually becomes somewhat divine. So childhood is a modern invention, but we could say that in Judaism, we have many sources, medieval and ancient, which attest to distinct phases of childhood development. So rituals which denote, critical moments in the development of child, circumcision, naming, the intricate ritual in Germany and northern France in the 12th century, which marked the initiation of boys at 5 or 6 through upsharing, feeding them a grand feast, and then of course bar mitzvah, when a child reaches the age of majority. So there's this, what? Yeah, and the haircut. When they enter school. So there's this overwhelmingly positive attitude towards childhood in Judaism, which is in contrast to many cultures. In the Talmud, it's written, of course, we know a parent is obligated to teach their child 4 things: to bring them to love, to bring them to work, to teach them to learn, and to swim. There's a lot of responsibility in the tending of children, and it's a privilege. Talmud says that childhood is a garland of roses. It says that the very breath of children is free from sin. It's also written that one may desecrate the Sabbath for the sake of a one-day-old baby, but not for a dead body. It's taught in Sanhedrin that every individual should perceive the world as having been created for his or her own sake. So there's this intrinsic value of the child, which extends to any child, not just your own child. Right, so Maimonides talks about one may not speak to orphans in other than a tender manner. One must show them courtesy, not hurt them physically, with hard toil, not wound their feelings with hard speech. One must take greater care of orphans than even of one's own child. And then there's the Midrash that describes God showing Moses all the treasures prepared in heaven for the righteous, and telling him that the most valuable treasure of all is reserved for those who bring up orphans. So beyond the individual child, Judaism also recognizes that the well-being of society is determined by our treatment of children. There is the heart of the story of the man who plants the carob tree that we all know. It's not for me, it's for my children and their children. We have a long history of valuing childhood, taking care of the child, and we're good at it. Historically, it's like our thing, right? Jewish family, eat this, eat more of this, check on the child, pick up the child. When was the last time a child called? You'll always be my child. I remember when you were this big, nachis. But we forget sometimes that the greatest wisdom in our tradition is that as much as we have this long history of valuing childhood, the stage is supposed to end. And that's, I think, part of where we are at this critical point in terms of development today. The bar mitzvah, traditionally the father stands on a bima and says, I'm no longer responsible for this child. And the child is supposed to learn from this that his parents are no longer responsible for his misdeeds, that he's now entering a realm in which he's no longer banging around in bumper cars, crashing into this and that, with the only consequence being laughter. He's now at the wheel of his life, and crashing hurts, not just him, but others. The poet Billy Collins has a poem on turning double digits, if anyone's seen it. It's a beautiful poem. And he says, "You tell me it's too early to be looking back, but that is because you've forgotten the perfect simplicity of being one, the beautiful complexity introduced by two. But I can lie in my bed and remember every digit. At 4, I was an Arabian wizard. I could make myself invisible by drinking a glass of milk. At 7, I was a soldier. At 9, a prince. But now, I'm mostly at my window, watching the late afternoon light. Back then, it never fell so solemnly against the side of my treehouse. This is the beginning of sadness, I say to myself as I walk through the universe in my sneakers. It is time to say goodbye to my imaginary friends, time to turn the first big number. It seems only yesterday I used to believe there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I would shine. But now when I fall on the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees and bleed." It's a melancholy poem, but in Judaism, the boy hears these words, I'm no longer responsible, and we celebrate it. It's a joyful thing. It's a simcha. I want to say, we had this past year different people from different faiths come in, like an interfaith conversation all year, and we had a woman come to speak about Sikhism. And she was going over the cardinal sins for the Sikhs, and we agreed with, we're just nodding, yeah, gluttony, yeah, jealousy, yeah, anger, and then she said emotional attachment is a sin. And all of the, Jewish parents in the room like, what? How can you not be emotionally attached? What about your children? And she said, what about, they're not my children. They're given to me. I take care of them. If something happens to them, it's kind of idolatrous to be as attached to them. But it was interesting. My community couldn't relate to that sin, that as a sin at all. In fact, the parent-child relationship, it's interesting. It's the only love relationship whose success is measured by your ability to separate. There's no other love relationship that is measured by you ultimately separating from that person. There was a 1979 child-rearing manual called Your 6-Year-Old, Loving and Defiant. And it had a list of all the different things that, to show that your kid is ready for first grade. And one of the things to show that your kid is ready for first grade is that he or she is able to navigate 8 blocks in the neighborhood by themselves. And if you say to yourself, well, it was a safer world back then, really? The 70s in New York was far more dangerous than it is today. And there's an Australian study that says, and I think it's really apropos to Americans, is that we today as parents, whether you call it helicopter parenting or over-parenting, indulgent parenting, we actually are causing our children to miss milestones that are really significant. So we all know about the milestones about when to roll over, when to walk, when to talk, but actually there are other milestones like when do you get your hair cut by yourself? When do you walk into a store and make a purchase? When are you able to advocate for yourself with a teacher? When do you start to cook for yourself? When do you do your own laundry? And those are actually really important developmental stages. There was recently a woman, Aubrey Ireland, I think she's at University of Cincinnati, who got a restraining order against her parents. She was dean's list in her college, and her parents were having her leave Skype on so they can watch her sleep, and had keystroke software put into her computer, and at some point she said, I'm like a dog with a collar on, and her parents can't come within 500 feet of her at this point. There was a study at the University of California that found that...
I know a lot of kids who would like that.
Yes. There was a study at the University of California that found that the more money we spend on our kids, on their education, the worse they do in school. We actually, somehow we know these things. The more parents are involved in schoolwork, studies say, the less less satisfied in life the children feel. And we also know it doesn't even give us joy. There's a study of women in Texas, and they were saying that house cleaning is more satisfying to them than caring for their children. Studies that compare American mothers to French mothers, where French mothers find it's much more pleasant to be with their kids than the American mothers who spend that much more time with their kids. So just to digress back to Captain Hook for a moment, because I think it really encapsulates kind of an American fantasy about the Peter Pan fantasy about never growing up. The first time I openly expressed my feelings about Captain Hook was at a wedding, and there was an Englishman at the table, and he looked at me for a moment and he said, "Peter Pan is actually the Hamlet of children's literature in England." And he explained, yes, the Hamlet. And he explained that in the original series, it's understood that all babies, until they turn 2, are actually able to fly. And they're all born part bird. And that at age 2, we just simply forget how to fly. And Peter was an infant, and he flew out his open window to visit the fairies of Kensington Garden, and they played together, and he got lost. And his mother became so distraught. She saw the open window. She thought he was kidnapped. So she locked the window, and when he came home, he couldn't get back in. So he's lost. And then he went to Neverland. And James Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, he had a brother named David who died in an ice skating accident. And his mother was so distraught at his death that she would dress James Barrie in his brother's clothes, would call him by his brother's name. And psychologists say that James Barrie, who was of stunted growth, actually potentially didn't grow because he was so stressed on trying to be this boy, his brother. And so he created this story about a boy who never dies, in part to comfort his mother. And it's just an interesting story about the whole tale from author to the execution, about not being able to let go and the damage that causes. In Judaism, childhood is valued, but it's not the goal. We put honey on letters because we want children to learn, and not for them to learn how to play games. We want them to actually know how to learn. We want them to be a participant in the world, to get out on the road, get out of the rink, to pick destinations and have the strength and wherewithal to reach them. I remember, for me, the moment that I felt I became an adult was when my parents sent me in my junior year of high school to France on a bicycle tour. And so I remember biking. We'd bike, however many miles a day in northern France, and often there was nowhere. We did 800 miles altogether, and often you didn't see anyone you knew, because we were miles and miles apart. And I remember one day, it was this rainy day, and the panniers on the back of my bike fell off, and I fell into the street, and there were all these French people, and they're looking down at me, and the rain running off their umbrellas into my eyes, and it was this really extraordinary moment to realize that I could actually fix my bicycle and get up and keep going. And from that point on, riding my bike took on a whole new meaning. I wasn't a participant, or I was a participant, not a puppet. I was the designer of this life. So childhood is supposed to end. In the Talmud, it's written that parents are obligated to teach kids these 4 things. And it's written that men usually, in the Shulchan Aruch, it said men usually it's the duty of every Jewish man to marry a wife in his 18th year, but no one should marry before he's 13. Childhood is not about nurturing and protecting and sheltering and smoothing, which I think is one of the things that our community thinks that it's about now. It's about loving the whole person, and by the whole person, we mean loving not just the developing, hungry mind of the child, but the participating adult that is about to emerge. So one of my heroes is Janis Korzak, who is mostly known for his death in escorting the children of the orphanage that he oversaw and dying in Treblinka with them. But he also was one of the most extraordinary Jewish educators of all time. He was an incredible activist for children's rights. He created a book on, he was really the first radical campaigner of children's rights. The UN's convention on the rights of child were based on his work. His fiction was adored in Poland in the same way that Alice in Wonderland was loved here. And one of the things that he wrote was, children are not the people of tomorrow. They are people today. They have a right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. And he talked about love a lot, which was sort of radical at the time, but he didn't talk about love as soothing and coddling. He talked about love in terms of rights and responsibilities. So I'm just going to share a couple more things, and then I hope we can open up to just a conversation about children and how we treat them. Humans have the longest childhoods of any species, and Americans have the longest childhoods of any humans. Our development unfolding at a very leisurely pace, requiring great parental investment in ripening that big, complex brain. And it's all also complicated by the way that we also sexualize children, even as we coddle them for so many years. And that's why our tradition tells us to teach these words to our children, to bind them as a sign around our hands and a frontlet between our eyes, to study the sacred texts while the grooves in your brain are still being forged. We teach kids not just to play, but to work. And that's really what our tradition, I think, is trying, what originally it's supposed to be doing. We celebrate the end of childhood, because when we don't celebrate the joy of being an adult, of taking the wheel, swimming and working and loving and participating, we have childhoods that get longer and longer and longer. And so the danger of that is that, one, our holidays become all child-centric. So part of it is we have to try to reclaim that. Our fundraising is all about people in their 20s who we sort of kind of painted as adolescents, which is also a much even later than childhood as a kind of new idea. But it's also that we have a concoction in our society of bullying, of name-calling, of scapegoating, of lying, of kind of whenever there's an election, it's really like a cartoon, it's like Looney Tunes. The solution to our urban problems is more cops, improve the schools, rebuild infrastructure, but don't make us pay for it. If any candidate was to stand before us and say, like a mature adult, there are going to be sacrifices, we're going to try to fix these problems, they wouldn't have a chance of being elected. We create a society where BB guns become real guns, where virtual reality becomes killing sprees, where video games become terrorism, where dressing up as Batman and fighting imaginary bad guys becomes dressing up as the Joker, and supervillains become role models. This science says that the human brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25. And the car industry knows it, and that's why, at 25 rates drop, and that's why the most dangerous people on the road are boys under the age of 25, because they're not yet able to make certain kinds of decisions. And so we specifically bind them, boys, like not to be egalitarian for a moment. We bind boys at 13 to Torah, to community, to tradition, to godliness. We bind them because 13 is when a boy because that's the age when their brains start developing. We celebrate them for all of those years that their brains develop, and we dance and we sing and we say life is a gift, and we make them aware of the privilege of responsibility and the poignancy of empathy and the consequence of action, so that when they skin their knee on the highway of life, mass murder is not an option, that a mature mind does not think mass murder is an option to explore, that is the tantrum of men whose childhoods have never ended. Who cannot conceive of succeeding in a world of adults? Who doesn't celebrate responsibility or take joy in fixing his own bike and sailing over the windy terrain? When the father says to the bar mitzvah, I'm no longer responsible, what he's really saying is, I open the door for you to this great, big, glorious world. I invite you to take our teachings, to explore and celebrate, and experience color and sound, and smell and taste and touch. We celebrate the end of childhood because it's the beginning of being a decision maker, and we dance in a great circle, and we will always love you, and it is a privilege to be entrusted with your child and a privilege to bear witness to your future. In the book version of Peter Pan, he says of death will be a great adventure. Death will be an awfully big adventure. Perhaps yes, but what about life? To journey from moment to moment, from kol nidre to kol nidre, to lift anchor, to lift your feet and set sail, that's what takes true courage. To claim a destiny, to kiss, to cry, to dream, to wake, to live. is the awfully wonderful adventure. So I wanted to just hopefully open it up. Just to talk about a little bit about our communities, just reactions or thoughts. I won't have answers, but just about where parenting, I mean, we're in a stage, I think, where for a lot of our communities, letting go is really so difficult for parents, and also for children as well to let go of their families. Also, it's a really big problem for baby boomers who are trying to save for their retirement, who find themselves paying for their kids' rent, and just not really being able to cut those ties. It damages in a lot of different ways. So I want to just open it up if there are thoughts. Yeah.
Well, your story about your bicycle was moving to me in that it reminded me of a saying in the Talmud that you can't stand on words of Torah until you've stumbled over them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it's like you didn't really own the bicycle until you've fallen off, and that's really a very nice parallel.
Yeah,
So-
we had, my older kids went to Sinai Kibbutz, and they had a group, they gathered all the mothers together, mothers of sons. So they gathered all the moms together and to have a talk with us. And one of the stories that they told was of a Native American tradition where at 13, they send their boys into the woods, and the only thing that you're allowed to give them is the mother can knit some sort of cloak for them. And it's so interesting that, they might die. There are a lot of bad things that can happen out there, and all we can do at a certain point is really just cover them, and hopefully, and hope that that holds them. But they're going to have to stumble to discover, on their own. Yeah.
I was just curious if you wanted to comment on one or both of these things. One would be the Hunger Games, just your thoughts about that.
Oh, yeah.
And secondly, the phenomenon of the teenager in our culture. This book, Get Out of My Life, the first page, Rabbi and Cheryl's The Mall. The dynamic between teenager and parent, and how you think that might be informed by the way we raise kids, and how it might be different in other cultures.
Right. And anything I say is not because I think I'm a great parent. I just want to point that out. I'm not saying this from a parent.
Have you let go?
Right. But in terms of so teenagers, it's interesting because I think they say that since 1850, the onset of puberty is about 6 years younger for both boys and girls, and 6 years. Yeah, and so, so what's interesting is we have laws about, sexuality around the age 18. 18 would have been when people reached the age of sexual maturity, over 100 years ago. But today they're reaching that at 12. And so the phenomenon of the adolescent is really somebody who is sexually mature, not emotionally mature, but sexually mature and still under the authority of their parents. And so there's an incredible clash with that. And I think and I don't know the answer, I think we indulge the sexual aspect. If you watch any television show geared towards teenagers, it's incredibly sexualized, and really reaching them at where their bodies are. And at the same time, they don't really have any authority in their lives, and they don't have that emotional growth. So, what was the first one? Yeah, so
Hunger Games.
Yeah. Oh, the Hunger Games. Yeah. So when I think of the Hunger Games, and I talk to my kids about the Hunger Games and some people in my congregation, but you forget sometimes that Israel was really founded by people that age, right? By teenagers. And that, that the ability to start revolution and to, really change the world, to fight for your life, comes from that kind of, people who have nothing to lose. They don't have kids yet, they don't have careers, and it's a powerful time, and it can be directed in all sorts of ways. I mean, the Hunger Games it's really just exaggerated reality TV, where you're sort of put in a bubble and you're watched, but the end is, instead of humiliation, it's death, which in our tradition is actually the same thing. But I think that our kids are exposed to incredible kind of stories like that. many of us might have, if you think about who our heroes are or were, and who our parents' heroes were or are, and then what our children or teenagers, what they think of as their heroes, whether it's Justin Bieber, writing to Anne Frank in the Anne Frank house. I hope you would have been a believer when you visited the Anne Frank house. That's kind of these aren't stories of changing the world. Yeah. Yes.
I love what you're saying. That at 13 the father is saying, "I'm opening this amazing world up to you."
Right.
But what can we be doing in our Jewish life, in the communal life, to really teach our children that, allow them to make certain decisions, whether it be educationally or religiously? What can we do?
So, one example might be, instead of just having kids collect money in a tzedakah box, to actually have them have board meetings and dress in a suit and tie, or a suit, pantsuit, and come to board meetings, sit in a boardroom instead of a classroom, and discuss where the money is going. To listen to arguments as to why this is important or that's important, and to actually, be empowered to make those decisions instead of just passively, putting money in a box. I think trips are really important, whether it's to Montgomery and learning about the Jewish South, or New Orleans, or any kind of trips that take the camp life as well. But really trying to create situations where they're empowered, but also educating parents that they can walk away as well. That they can actually let their kids make valuable decisions.
I've been struck, and I don't know what you make of this, by the case that we make about over-coddling our kids, and that whole discussion. And anytime it gets brought up in our congregation, and it's certainly even with my peers, everyone's on board. Yeah, absolutely, totally.
Right.
And then they're doing it
Right.
without knowing it. So I don't know, what we make of that and how.
Well, there's a lot of pressure to do it. I'll just quickly say so my oldest son was at Hamilton, at Sinai, and he just started today high school at Hamilton Music and Arts. And I got enormous pressure from people. Oh, you shouldn't go there. It's not a good school. There aren't going to be a lot of Jews there. There are gangs. The academics aren't as good. And it was so much pressure not to send him there. And he loves music, and he's not, that academic. But it's hard to resist that pressure. And then, seeing him walk into the school today with his kippah and his rolling bag, and after like a furtive secret hug from me behind the car, in a rainbow of other kids of all different sizes and shapes, it was such a kind of spiritual relief. Like, oh right, we're in the world. I was so grateful to be there, but I think there's just a lot of pressure to follow. When my oldest was little, and when my oldest was a toddler, I remember being at a picnic with other families from Temple Isaiah, and one of them said, "Does anyone else feel like their child is ready for a marble tower? Are they ready now?" I didn't realize that marble towers was like a stage, but I think we invent all these stages. They're ready for tennis lessons. They're ready for, and if you miss that stage, you feel like a bad parent, and I think it's compounded by the working parent phenomenon too. I think that we want to give more because we feel like we're not present. Yeah.
I think it's important to try and think of what are the larger issues or influences on all of this. I think it's a really important topic, and I think part of where parents are coming from is this sense of our loss of control in the world, of what we can control, what we can handle, how much of the world is out of our control. And another related to that, there was a terrific article in the past week or two by Robert Putnam, who's about what it was like for him growing up in someplace upstate New York, and the way there were all different kind of kids, and basically lower class kids, but people took care of them. It was basically like they were all our kids. Kids got along. The kids who didn't go to college, how he got a scholarship because other people suggested. It's this narrowing of focus where all that we feel we can barely control is our own families, our own nuclear families, and we have a very soft focus on anybody else's kids and on the larger society, on the state. So I think it can't, the fixation on our own children and grandchildren, I must say, and the Nakas machine in the Jewish community, I think is to some extent a reflection of the lack of, that you know in your congregation better than many of us, how important it is to do serious social justice work,
Right.
looking at the society and being
Yes.
involved with it and caring about other people's children.
Yes, I agree. Well said. Yeah.
One of the things that's distinctly different in this generation is that 90% of kids have distinct graphic in their hands.
Right.
And most of their energy is somewhere else than when they are actually physically.
Point. Yeah.
So either they're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter
Right.
or on the internet, anywhere but where they are now. Now, I'm just curious in terms of how that influences what you were saying. Does it actually empower them in a way by, distancing them from the helicopter parent?
Right.
Or does it have, we know about the negative influences, of course, but
Right.
does it have any mitigating?
Well, it's interesting because teenagers no longer do Facebook. So, and part of the reason is because they don't want to get messages on their walls from their parents saying, "Hi, sweetie." So I think that that some of it, whether it's good or bad, it's sort of here and undeniable. But I think technology enables parents to actually be more present in their kids' lives and more invasive. And one of the new businesses that's cropped up over the last couple of years is the whole is camps. Where you have every day photos are being uploaded and I forget the bunkmate or and so camps. And the problem is that camps are getting calls from parents. I didn't see a picture of my kid today. My kid wasn't smiling. My kid wasn't participating. And I don't want to romanticize the past. It's not that I want to romanticize the past, which is very common to do. But we do know that kids that they're not happy. We talk about the 20s and the 30s. They're actually kids who grew up with that kind of parenting. On college campuses, the administration calls them Crispies because they're so burnt out by the time they get to college that they're just too fried to do anything. So that's just their name for them. So I don't. Yeah, it's a good question. Just a side note on technology. I wrote a pledge, which I'd be happy to share with anyone, to be read from the pulpit, to not text while driving. And it's I just thought that if a congregation takes that pledge in a sacred space before God and each other, that maybe they would be more likely to do it. 75% of teens say they watch their parents text and drive. Texting while driving kills 11 teens every day and is 6 times more dangerous than drunk driving. So I'd love to share that with you. I think it'd be really great if we could have our congregants try to commit to that.
As I was listening to you, I felt really caught in 2 directions. I understand your main point about childhood was an invention of modern times, and Judaism is really about letting go of that and moving on. And yet, in my personal life, when I counsel people, when I connect with people I've never met before, I find that stories from our childhood really shape who we are.
Yes.
And so, as I was listening to you, I was fighting with you because I was thinking to myself, no, we're so defined by our childhood stories, and they really shape who we become and who we don't become. And so I just wanted to throw that.
I think that's interesting. I mean, I had a lovely childhood, and yet with all of the just the being taken care of, and all the sweetnesses of upper middle class upbringing in Connecticut. One of the most powerful moments of my childhood, in terms of who I am today, was when I told my father I wanted to be an author. I wanted to write novels, and he said, "I will never consider you an author until you finish a book." And he's a very loving man, but he really believes in work, and he said, when you finish a book, even if it's never published, then you're an author. But if you just talk about being a writer and you write some stories here and there, you're not an author. So come back to me when you write a book. And in college I did. It was never published, but it was, I think that there's a mix of that taking care of, but also pushing them out a little bit, But I fight with myself too. I mean, I'm not saying this as any kind of model of, my first child, when he called for mama when he was going to bed, I was there before the second syllable. So my third child, I didn't even sing lullabies to. Yes.
Thank you for sharing. I think it's really been a good learning. Comment and a question. There is a really powerful essay written by Emmanuel Levinas called The Religion for Adults. And he's a French philosopher, so you have to get through a lot of gobbledygook, but there's some really powerful messages there. So for me, one other thing, there was a study done a while ago about the average distance that mothers would allow their children to wander. And it used to be like 3 blocks, and now it's like 100 feet or something like that. So it's like sort of. I wonder though, as a rabbi and sort of responsible for one small sliver of a very large community, how can we in our institutions shape a cultural affect that affects like our religion and our community? Because I think tackling the childhood helicoptering parenting is actually really big and really immense, but how can we at least create a sense of communal responsibility even for each other's kids inside our institutions? And then how do we get our kids to transform Rosh Hashanah from being about apples, honey, and puppet shows to being about some of the really deeper aspects of life so that they can recover and sort of reimagine a religion for adults? Because the Talmud was not written for children, so like,
right.
That's the question.
I mean, I think, the first congregation that I worked in, I know that in Connecticut, the rabbi, when he met with new potential members, always said, here at this temple, we're all about creating Jewish memories. And I always thought that was an interesting kind of thing to say, that was what you did was create memories, because it's like, who are the memories for? They're for your kids, but you're not actually living. It's kind of like when you go on vacation, you're always behind your camera. You're not actually experiencing it. And it's the same thing, I've had congregants say, when they start really learning about Judaism and they start, kind of catching fire with it, and they'll say, well, I don't know if it's worthwhile for me to even light Shabbat candles when, it's 4:30 because my husband's not home and my kids aren't there, so they're like no witnesses. Like, well, why would I do it? And that interesting idea that everything is done just to model for someone else so that they get this kind of picture of Judaism, but not actually, that it's actually valuable just for you as an adult. So I think for communities, I think it's really about educating the adults. I think it's really about talking to parents about what they're holding on to and what their needs are, and and also I think all parents agree that they want their children to be successful in life. So maybe helping people to define what that means, and actually showing them that some of the things that we do that feel really good at the moment are actually damaging them. And if we want them to be successful, we actually have to allow them to sharpen these particular tools.
So I wanted to share something. I knew of a friend and teacher, Rabbi who spoke about how to shift the mitzvah industry a little bit, and I think we're all in some ways accountable to it. We critique it for legitimate reasons, but it's a real engine of our communities, and to totally gainsay it wouldn't make much sense. But he talked about, and every community has to do it differently. How do you turn the event from being one where the child thinks that it's the congregation's opportunity to get to know him or her, to the child's opportunity to get to know the congregation and the tradition and the world out there? Because so much of the way the structure is set up is this is your day, this is the day that you shine, you take over the service. In some communities, that can be overdone. What are the different things that are shifted in the organic culture of each synagogue for the glass, for the mirror, whatever the image is, to be turned around the direction. This opportunity for you to see the Jew and be exposed to, be invited into the Jewish adulthood that you're stepping into, as opposed to our infatuation with who you are right now. So I don't have an answer, but I think that's interesting for you.
The Pius Sessner, the Eish Kodesh, writes in the 20s or the 30s about his deep concern about where kids are going. And what he sees is that they're encouraged and kind of they're encouraged and kind of coddled to become kind of these individuals long before and mature long before their time. And it's not to say that they should be treated as young children and be watched only as far as like 100 feet, as far as you can go, but to train them to think as community members and to have that. And so actually he says, no, actually have them be studying Gemara. Take on the community process, take on the debate, the dialogue, finding the nuance, take on the tradition, all that comes in, really engross the kids in that, in our tradition, in the community, and from that then you'll produce adults who are actually mentions.
I was listening to you, I was thinking about how a lot of it is integrated with class. Because it's not the phenomenon that you're talking about. And it's not the only experience of the Jewish community, and certainly in the whole community. And in my area, on the east side of town, it's a different. And when I visit the west side, and now this is also super oversimplified, but I do have a different sense. I do think it's a parental trend all along, but I do think that there are serious class issues that are woven in. And I think, and there's something about privilege and access to privilege that is disabling kids. And I think for the Jewish community that does have quite a bit of affluence, to be able to name how privilege can be disabling is really important. And then I think it's also important to remember there are Jewish kids who don't have the same privilege, and so their issues are different. But I do think that there is, that in all cases, people need to get their basic needs met, and one of those is for autonomy, and some of those are just for love and connection and support. So if we look at the basic needs and then see in which areas they're not getting met, depending on where you live and what your situation is, then I think we get to the core, what is really, how are we in the most ways raising healthy children, no matter what the context is. But naming that in this situation it's different because of access to privilege and because of a sort of seclusion inside the Jewish community. And in the east sides of town, there are not a synagogue on every corner. And it's frustrating sometimes. You can't find kosher food. It's really,
Come to Pico Robertson.
Yeah, but I'm not going to always try to Pico Robertson. And there are such gifts that our kids get from being and learning how to be really urban, diverse.
Right, and so there was a study done looking at homicides in South LA, and number of kids that have died. And suicides in Beverly Hills, and the numbers equal. But there were the same numbers of kids were dying. Just one was suicide and one homicide. One of the things just to close that I like to do when I talk to bar mitzvah families, when they talk about the blessing that they want to give from the bima, they want it to be 20 minutes long. We're all fighting that, and many of us have abolished that. But I'll say, if you talk about that beautiful moment of birth, I just want you to remember that there are people in the congregation at the moment who had just suffered miscarriage. When you talk about how lucky you are to have met the perfect man or the perfect woman, and that you're so blessed. It's such a day of blessing that there are people who are going through divorce, right? That all of that is fine, you know, at the toast, at the celebration. But in a sanctuary, to kind of uphold how wonderful and privileged you are and all the blessings, you're actually hurting other people. And you're also just showing how unaware you are of just the human condition. And the truth is that even the most overprotective among us can't protect our children. We can't protect them from disease. We can't protect them from, you know, what happened to a 2-year-old in my congregation who got strangled by and died from the reins of his rocking horse. You know, you can't, in a very protective family. You know, so we do what we can and we love them, but I think you're right. I think it's about opening our own eyes to others, and also for adults, you know, it's actually a gift to reclaim some of your friendships and some of your evenings back. I think, you know, families, parents want that. It's good for kids too. So anyway, thank you for